Hello, my name is Rovina Cai. I'm a freelance illustrator from Melbourne, Australia. In this video, I'm going to show you some of my process and explain how I made this illustration based on the Brothers Grimm fairy tale Thousand Furs. In the story, there is a cloak made of different kinds of animal fur, and that is the subject that I'm illustrating. I'm going to be using a combination of watercolor for the background texture, black color pencil for the drawing, and some gouache for the color highlights. So I start off by sketching in Photoshop, and to transfer it onto my drawing paper, I trace around the sketch and make a simple line drawing, which I then print out onto my paper. The line drawing that I printed was very faded, so I'm just tracing around it a little bit with a color pencil. I'm using these lines as a guide for my watercolor wash, and my aim is to actually completely cover them with the watercolor so you won't see any of these lines in the final. I'm now ready to apply the watercolor wash, and I start with the darkest areas using a synthetic brush. I'm working very quickly and intuitively here, and my focus is on creating interesting shapes and textures. I'm using a combination of black watercolor and a color called Shadow Violet from Daniel Smith. Shadow Violet has some really interesting properties where it granulates, which means it creates these little specks as it dries, and it also has separating colors, so some areas will look slightly reddish while other areas are bluish. These subtle color shifts and textures are perfect for what I'm trying to create in this illustration. I want some of my edges to be quite blurry and blend into the background, but I want others near the head and the arm to be really sharp and defined, so I'm using a smaller brush in those areas and outlining really carefully around the edges. Once my first layer of wash is dry, I add some paint splatters to the surface. I'm just covering the head and the arm because I don't want any paint in those areas. And I'm also just going back in with a second wash to darken some of the areas at the bottom of the page. So now it's time to start drawing, and I start by finding sort of a corner of the illustration that doesn't matter very much, and I start there just to get a feel for everything and warm up a little bit. In this first pass, I'm just trying to find interesting shapes in the watercolor texture and trying to fit animals into them. So for example, if I see like a squarish shape, I might look at my reference photo and see if there are any similar animals that would fit into that shape. I'm being really loose with my lines here and I'm just sketching things in, not really too worried about any details. Once my animals are loosely sketched in, I go in for a second pass. I'm still working very loosely here, but this time around I'm focusing on the fur patterns and textures. Again, I'm looking at my reference photos and I'm making sure that in my illustration I have a good variety of animals represented, and that similar patterns are spread out evenly around the composition. In addition to looking at photos of animals for reference, I'm also looking at things like coral patterns and fabric folds, anything that'll give me a wide variety of textures to draw. At this stage, I start adding details to the head and the hands. I want the character to look like she's sort of emerging from this giant mass of animals. So I want her to look very ethereal and kind of glowy. So as I'm drawing, I'm using a very, very sharp pencil and I'm being very delicate. And I'm working very lightly to gradually build up the shading. So now that I have a solid foundation down, I know roughly how everything will look in the illustration, so I'm ready to start adding all the details. It's just a matter of rendering out all the different textures, making sure all the shapes have some complexity to them, and darkening shadows, and basically just giving everything one more pass for detail. After adding in all the details and building up my shading, I want to pull out some highlights to create more contrast in the image. So I'm using a wide pastel pencil to lighten some of the areas. I'm also using a clean, dry synthetic brush to blend in some of the pastel so that everything looks cohesive. With the drawing mostly complete, I'm adding some blue highlights using gouache. These are just little decorative elements that I like to add for contrast and visual interest. Once I'm done with the blue, I realize that my white highlights could be a little stronger, so I go back in with a white pastel pencil as well, just to bring out more contrast in the image. I had intended to leave the hair completely unshaded so that it would look sort of ethereal and like it was glowing, but I realize now that it looks slightly unfinished, so I'm just going back in and adding some subtle shading to that area. I'm also just giving my drawing one more pass and adding some loose expressive lines around the edges. Sometimes in the process of shading things in and making things darker, I tend to over render things, and so I'm just going back in now to add back those swishy lines to make everything look like it's very expressive and to create movement throughout the whole image. Once I'm done with my finishing touches, I spray the drawing with a matte fixative, and then it's ready to be scanned or matted or framed, and that's it. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and learned some new techniques, and thank you for watching.